5 companies were ordered to an eminence on the right, and 5 to another on the left. It happened to be my fate to be stationed on the left, a place the most dangerous of the two, as it was nearest to the enemy, and more exposed to the fire from the enemy's batteries. James Duncan, Captain, Continental Artillery Officer.
Reading the letters and journals of those who fought for America's independence can spark a moment of clarity, a deeper awareness and appreciation for the immense sacrifices made to secure our country's freedom.
The enemy maintained a continuous fire from his forts on our redoubts, which we had taken. They also had the skill to throw during the night 5 or 6 bombs in our redoubt, which exploded and which killed a few grenadiers and chasseurs. I assure you, my very dear uncle, that one had to crouch on the ground all night to avoid the cannons and the bombs. Wilhelm Graf von Schwerin, German grenadier officer, French forces.
It's hard to fathom the courage it must have taken to leave behind the safety of home and face the brutal uncertainty of war, especially for those who had no choice but to fight, forced to leave behind friends and families and the life they knew. Called to stand against the empire that still held dominion over them, and yet, whether driven by duty, a desire for freedom, or the weight of a draft they couldn't escape, young and old, men and women, free and enslaved, rose to the call, pledging themselves to a cause far greater than any one life.
The scene viewed from the camp now was grand, particularly after dark. A number of shells from the works of both parties passing high in the air and descending in a curve, each with a long train of fire that exhibited a brilliant spectacle. Ebenezer Denny, Captain, Continental Army.
Over the years and across various seasons, Sarah and I returned time and again to one of the most pivotal battlefields in America's fight for freedom. It's here that the final major battle of the American Revolutionary War took place.
This afternoon, our division went on fatigue to forward our works near the enemy's lines. They keep up a continual firing this whole day. A French officer got his leg shot off by a cannonball from the British. He was advanced in front of our works. William Feltman, Lieutenant, 1st Pennsylvania Regiment, Continental Army.
Amid desolate fields and man-made embankments, one can almost picture the brave patriots whose lives came to mirror the very trenches they carved. Worn down, exposed to the elements, shaped inch by inch under the relentless pressure of war.
At daylight, the enemy were roused to the greatest exertions. The engines of war have raged with redoubled fury and destruction on both sides. No cessation, day or night. Dr. James Thatcher, Surgeon, Continental Army.
Perhaps unintentionally mirroring the careful strategy of the campaign itself. The first checkpoint Sarah and I always assemble at during visits here is the Yorktown Battlefield Visitor Center. Expanding our knowledge before venturing onto the fields where the conflict took place, in hopes of locating strategic points of the siege that will help even those who aren't history fanatics follow along and connect with the complex events that happened here. In the following episode, we retrace the events that unfolded, taking you through forest and fields, across creeks, past artillery parks, and to the former sites of field hospitals and military encampments, including Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, George Washington's. As our exploration continues, we come to the very places where victory was vigorously shaped, walking through the reconstructed 1st and 2nd parallel siege lines, each one a grueling undertaking under sometimes horrific conditions. We also surveyed 2 of the enemy's fortified barricades that stood in the way of victory at Yorktown, stepping inside the heart of one of them to detail the events that took place there. Thereafter, we make our way to an 18th century home set next to the York River, the location where the terms of the surrender were drawn up during the Siege of Yorktown. While there, we'll explore the exterior and what took place inside the house. Then finally, our path leads us to the very field where the surrender occurred. Upon our arrival, we'll ascend the scenic watchtower, which offers sweeping views of the historic site, before descending the spiral walkway and stepping onto the very grounds where the war reached its final chapter. Moving throughout historic landscapes, we also uncover the location of an abandoned British redoubt, the weathered remains of the only original outer defensive fortification from the Siege of Yorktown that survived for centuries. Throughout this entire story, you'll hear the eyewitness accounts from soldiers and commanders, their innermost thoughts revealed through actual journals and reports written during the conflict. As Washington famously said early in the fight for freedom,
"The fate of unborn millions will now depend under God on the courage and conduct of this army. Our cruel and unrelenting enemy leaves us no choice but a brave resistance, or the most abject submission. This is all we can expect. We have therefore to resolve to conquer or die. Our own country's honor all call upon us for a vigorous and manly exertion. And if we now shamefully fail, we shall become infamous to the whole world. General George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army."
We've driven this stretch of the Colonial Parkway in Virginia more times than I can count. From Colonial Williamsburg to Yorktown, and the other way to Jamestown. Under the tree canopy, through the old tunnel, winding alongside the scenic views of the James and York Rivers. You can't drive it completely as of this story's release, as long sections of the parkway have been closed for long-term construction. But maybe that just reflects how much time has quietly slipped by since we first started capturing these places. This clip you're seeing is from years ago, back when the entire historic road was fully open for travel. This was one of many visits headed to Yorktown that have stretched from then till now. Part of a personal educational journey that now spans years. My quest to learn more about the Siege of Yorktown definitely hasn't been a one-time thing. It's been ongoing, revisited on multiple occasions, with each trip peeling back a little more of the story. Fast forward to the present day, and here I am again, standing inside the reconstructed remains of the British inner defenses that once stood here. These broad, built-up ridges of dirt that mark the final stronghold of resistance at Yorktown.
The town was surrounded by a ditch and thick parapet, having a hornwork in the center, in which were batteries lined with fascines. Samuel Graham, Captain, British Army.
The hornwork, the trenches, the wide-open terrain between them. You can still see the slope of the embankments as they once were. In military terms, they're known as earthworks. Various arrangements of defensive barriers carved from the earth to shield troops from enemy fire. Something you'll see plenty of throughout the following story.
Long ago, the British built this fortification, these earthworks, to block the main road into Yorktown. And this reconstruction of their defenses is quite impressive to witness in person, and it really helps you visualize what the originals would have looked like. And there does appear to be a trail right here. But with the overgrowth during this time of year, it looks like the pathway leading to the interior of the hornwork isn't as visible.
Although I was in British territory, George Washington's firm reminder for those not engaged in digging trenches similar to the enemy's here rung out in my mind.
You can see right here is a quote from General George Washington. Persons whose duty does not call them to the trenches
and to assemble there merely to indulge curiosity are to walk on the reverse of the trenches, that they may not interrupt the works.
Oftentimes as I walk these old lines, my thoughts take me back, oddly enough, to a board game I first played when I was a kid.
This is Stratego, not a place, not a time, but a battle of wit and skill and strategy. Stratego, we're generals, field marshals, scouts and lieutenants. Miners and spies all conspire with bombs and brains to capture the enemy flag, to win the battle, to win the game.
The battlefield is simple. Red on one side, blue on the other. You set up your defenses in secret, buried your bombs, protected your flag, and waited. The game was about deception, about reading your opponent and daring them to make a wrong move, and praying you hadn't made one first. It wasn't just a game, it was really strategy, bluff, and chance all at once. In my mind, the land beneath my feet, Yorktown, became this game board. It's where British, French, and American soldiers eventually dug in, built fortified lines alongside strongholds, and positioned their artillery and batteries. But much like in the game of Stratego, where the smallest piece, a spy, can take down the strongest if he strikes at just the right time, the British, who had long underestimated the Americans as a mere nuisance, failed to recognize the growing strength of the combined American and French forces, which would soon become the greatest threat since the start of the Revolutionary War. In the year or so leading up to Yorktown, Lord Cornwallis, commanding British forces in the South, had earlier victories at Charleston and Camden. However, things began to unravel after a costly and exhausting battle at Guilford Courthouse. At first, I thought his downfall was all about British battlefield losses and Patriot resistance in the Carolina backcountry. But the more I read, the more I realized another one of Cornwallis's challenges was higher up the chain of command. He was caught in a slow, frustrating back and forth with General Sir Henry Clinton, the British commander-in-chief. Delayed orders, vague instructions, and growing distrust strained their already shaky relationship. Cornwallis's grueling 3-month campaign in North Carolina, chasing Major General Nathaniel Greene of the Continental Army with limited supplies, wore down his troops, all while British control in South Carolina collapsed in his absence. Clinton blamed the setbacks on overstretched forces and weakened positions. By April 25, 1781, frustrated by slow progress in the Carolinas, Cornwallis marched into Virginia to cut supply lines, blocking the routes the Americans used to send food, weapons, and other supplies, and to rally loyalists or colonists still loyal to Britain, hoping they would join his cause. He made this move without waiting for direct orders from Clinton. Cornwallis hoped this bold step would help regain momentum for the British war effort, but it left South Carolina open for Major General Greene to regain control. He later detailed his concerns in his writings.
I was most firmly persuaded that until Virginia was reduced, we could not hold the more southern provinces, and that, after its reduction, they would fall without resistance and be retained without much difficulty.
Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis,
British Army.
By May 20th, 1781, Cornwallis reached Petersburg, Virginia, where he combined forces with thousands of troops previously under the command of Benedict Arnold, the American traitor, and General William Phillips, who had died unexpectedly just days before his arrival. Even with their strained relationship, Clinton, perhaps recognizing the necessity of holding the region, recommended that Cornwallis establish a defensive position in the Chesapeake area, either at Williamsburg near the James River or Yorktown on the York River, to help maintain Britain's grip on the southern colonies.
I beg leave to recommend it to you as soon as you have finished the active operations you may be now engaged in, to take a defensive station in any healthy situation you choose, be it at Williamsburg or Yorktown. General Sir Henry Clinton to Cornwallis.
Cornwallis's troops made a brief stop at Williamsburg, Virginia, where he received new orders. He was told to set up a defensive position at either Portsmouth or Yorktown because Clinton had learned that a French fleet might be headed toward New York, where he was headquartered. Frustrated by the shifting plans and a request for more troops, Cornwallis crossed the James River at Jamestown and proceeded to Portsmouth in early July of 1781. Confusing and delayed orders from Clinton, shifting between sending troops to New York or Philadelphia and suggesting various defensive positions in Virginia, left Cornwallis constantly adjusting his plans. In their letters, he explained why he rejected those suggestions and ultimately chose Yorktown.
I shall, in obedience to the spirit of your Excellency's orders, take measures with as much dispatch as possible to seize and fortify York and Gloucester, being the only harbor in which we can hope to be able to give effectual protection to line of battle ships. I shall likewise use all my expedition in my power to evacuate Portsmouth and the posts belonging to it, but until that is accomplished, it will be impossible for me to spare troops, for York and Gloucester, from their situation, command no country, and a superiority in the field will not only be necessary to enable us to draw forage and other supplies from the country, but likewise to carry on our works without interruption. Lord Cornwallis to Sir Henry Clinton.
Defector Benedict Arnold, once a skilled officer of the Continental Army, whose military brilliance was widely recognized, reportedly expressed concern that Cornwallis's position near Yorktown could be vulnerable. While no definitive record I could find confirms he warned Cornwallis directly, his insights were sharp, traits ultimately overshadowed by his betrayal. This idea is dramatized in the hit TV series Turn, Washington Spies.
So we cannot establish a position at Yorktown. We are completely vulnerable now. Vulnerable? From whom? Nathaniel Greene. I just defeated him. And how about the French fleet? Yorktown is set upon a narrow neck of land, like this. With a few ships, the enemy can cut us off here or here and intercept our retreat. We should move up the James River instead. I can read a map, sir. I know weakness when I see it.
Despite any warnings he may have received, by August 1st, 1781, after skirmishes like Green Spring and Spencer's Ordinary, plus other clashes with Lafayette's forces along the way, Cornwallis took Yorktown while Banastre Tarleton moved to Gloucester, both fortifying their positions, believing Yorktown was secure for support or evacuation. What he didn't yet realize was that a powerful Allied campaign, by land and sea, was quietly taking shape. Before we moved deeper into the battlefield, I took one final trek through the enemy's inner defenses, picturing these lands once teemed with redcoats and artillery. By August 18th of 1781, the Continental Army and their French allies began a new phase of the Revolutionary War, marching southward toward Yorktown. But before the march began and the armies set their sights on Virginia, a story was already in motion, one worth pausing to explore. Washington had originally favored an attack on British-occupied New York City. However, a lack of naval support and other setbacks shifted his strategy. Commander of the French forces, Lieutenant General Rochambeau, never fully convinced by the idea of attacking New York, wrote to Admiral de Grasse, commander of the French Navy. De Grasse had sailed earlier that year with a large fleet from France to the West Indies to protect French colonial interests there, particularly in the region now known as the Caribbean. In his letter to him, Rochambeau urged de Grasse to sail north and coordinate with the Continental forces, proposing a joint campaign that could shift the course of the war. Rochambeau's letter detailed 2 potential points for an offensive.
There are 2 points at which an offensive can be made against the enemy: Chesapeake and New York. The southwesterly winds and the state of defense in Virginia will probably make you prefer the Chesapeake Bay, and it will be there where we think you may be able to render the greatest service. Lieutenant General Rochambeau, French Royal Army.
The letter also instructed de Grasse to send a frigate to Newport, informing the French forces there of the chosen target he decided on. Soon Washington and Rochambeau learned that the large French battle fleet was steering toward the Chesapeake, not New York. With this news, their plans shifted quickly. A rare opportunity was opening in the Chesapeake, but it wouldn't last long. De Grasse could only hold his position for a limited time, and if Washington was going to act, it had to be soon. This meant they could surround the British, cutting off any hope of escape by sea, and trapping Cornwallis and his forces at Yorktown if successful. Using deceptive tactics to create the illusion of an attack on New York, by August 19, 1781, the combined American and French armies began a covert march toward Virginia. False intelligence that began earlier in the year and lasted throughout the summer reinforced this trickery, hoping to keep Clinton guessing and preventing him from sending assistance to Cornwallis and Virginia, as he panicked and requested additional forces for New York.
I enclose to your lordship copies of some intercepted letters. By these your lordship will see that we are threatened with a siege. Your lordship can therefore spare 2,000, and the sooner they come, the better.
General Sir Henry Clinton to Cornwallis.
On September 5, 1781, as the Allied armies were still in pursuit of Yorktown on foot, a battle at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay took place. French Admiral de Grasse, commanding a fleet of 24 ships, went head-to-head with British Admiral Graves, who had 19 ships under his command, in what became known as the Battle of the Capes. Cannon smoke filled the air as the 2 fleets clashed off the Virginia coast. In the end, de Grasse's fleet held its ground, forcing the British ships to retreat. With the French Royal Fleet now in control of the bay and the mouth of the Chesapeake closed off, Cornwallis was effectively trapped. No reinforcements could reach him by sea, and with the Allied land forces getting closer to Yorktown by the day, his options were rapidly diminishing. On September 14, 1781, after a long march from New York, Washington and Rochambeau arrived in Williamsburg, Virginia, and began gathering their troops. There, Washington finally reunited with the Marquis de Lafayette, who had been shadowing British forces through the southern colonies for months. One onlooker would later humorously recall it as a moment worth remembering.
No man ever greeted his mistress with more joy than did Lafayette and Washington greet each other. Witness to Washington and Lafayette's reunion in Williamsburg, Virginia.
It was here, at the home of George Wythe, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, that Washington set up his headquarters. In the weeks leading up to the battle to come, Washington, Rochambeau, Lafayette, and other officers strategized here, understanding that this campaign could determine the direction of the revolution. Just around the corner from George Wythe's front door stood the home of another influential figure from early Williamsburg. During the siege of Yorktown, a young man, just 29 years old, was beginning to leave a lasting mark on this city. St. George Tucker, a respected legal scholar, judge, and legal professor at the College of William and Mary, served with the Virginia militia during the Revolution. His home and legacy still very much present in Williamsburg today. He once fought as a major in Lawson's brigade at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina, being later promoted to lieutenant colonel and returning to service during the siege of Yorktown. St. George Tucker didn't witness Yorktown from a distance. He lived it, through the thunder of cannon fire, the digging of trenches, and the long nights without sleep. He once recounted the scene at Williamsburg prior to the siege in his writings.
As soon as the means of transportation could be procured for the French army, they moved up to Williamsburg, where the French army, the light infantry, and the Pennsylvania line encamped in a line extending from a small creek near Powell's plantation to Ludwell's mill pond. Matters were in this situation when the arrival of General Washington on the 14th of September, 1781, gave new hopes and spirits to the army. St. George Tucker, Lieutenant Colonel and interpreter for Governor and General Thomas Nelson Jr. and his French allies.
His journals offer some of the most detailed personal accounts of what took place that survived to this day. Raw glimpses into the chaos, courage, and exhaustion of that final stand. His writings also reveal that before the siege, while staying in Williamsburg, Major General Lafayette and General Rochambeau worked closely with General Washington as they prepared for the campaign ahead. Just a few blocks from Washington's headquarters at the Wythe House, Rochambeau stayed at the Peyton Randolph House, the former home of the first president of the Continental Congress, who had died 6 years earlier in 1775. His house in Williamsburg served as the temporary French headquarters during the preparations for the siege of Yorktown. Later in 1824, Lafayette would also stay at the house during his victory tour of the United States. In a letter St. George Tucker wrote to his wife, who was kin to the Randolphs, he noted Rochambeau's stay, writing,
George Washington's quarters are at Mr. Wythe's house. Aunt Betty Randolph has the honor of the Comte de Rochambeau to lodge at her house. St. George Tucker, Lieutenant Colonel and interpreter for Governor and General Thomas Nelson Jr. and his French allies.
Among the many troops who gathered near Williamsburg in September of 1781, one soldier who later wrote of his experience at Yorktown put his recollections to paper decades after the events that took place. Beginning his military career at the young age of 15, Joseph Plum Martin, despite his mother's hesitation, enlisted as a private. By the time of Yorktown, he had risen to the rank of sergeant.
Soon after landing, we marched to Williamsburg, where we joined General Lafayette, and very soon after, our whole army arriving, we prepared to move down and pay our old acquaintance, the British at Yorktown, a visit. Joseph Plum Martin, Sergeant, Continental Army.
His journals also offer a fascinating and personal perspective on the events that unfolded during the conflict, including a vivid, patriotic recollection of one striking moment.
I confess I felt a secret pride swell my heart when I saw the Star-Spangled Banner waving majestically in the very faces of our implacable adversaries. Joseph Plum Martin, Sergeant, Continental Army.
On September 28, 1781, Washington, along with his fellow commanders, finally began the march from Williamsburg to Yorktown, with their combined forces ready to carry out the siege they had planned. Right, so now we're going to take a quick tour through the battlefield tour road of encampment areas. This is a one-way road, but back here is where the American and French forces would have been encamped, including their artillery parks, as well as Rochambeau's camp and General Washington's camp, which we'll be seeing here shortly. As they drew within a mile of Yorktown, the sites for the Army's camps, hospitals, artillery parks, and supply areas were selected. Time was running short, but the Chesapeake Bay remained blocked, preventing any reinforcements by sea, but every moment counted. With critical positions to secure in their efforts to support the upcoming siege, both armies began organizing the vital infrastructure needed to sustain the operation and their forces. French encampments, too, were taking shape nearby. Along with their own artillery parks, reinforcing the Allied presence with precision and firepower.
We arrived on the 29th of September, less than 1 1/4 miles from York, where the enemy had fortified himself. Our camp was in such a forest that we could not be discovered.
Wilhelm Graf von Schwerin, German grenadier officer, French forces.
The woods Sarah and I were now driving through were the very places where so many men went to work preparing for the fight that was to come. Pausing near these now quiet forests just outside the enemy lines, I imagined what the scene might have been like. The rhythmic chopping of axes, the sound of saws cutting timber, the hammering of tools, and the rustle of canvas as tents were stretched and pitched for the troops. George Washington reflected on the early labor that took place during their approach to Yorktown and throughout these woodlands in his diary.
Much diligence was used in debarking and transporting the stores, cannon, etc. from Treble's Landing, distant 6 miles, on James River to camp, which, for want of teams, went on heavily, and in preparing fascines, gabions, etc. for the siege.
General George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army.
Soldiers carved a war camp from the wilderness, assembling not just tents and earthen kitchens, but the backbone of the siege. Washington's cannons and mortars, the heavy wagons to haul them, the carts brimming with powder and shot, still being dragged into place in the tense days before the approaching storm.
The American troops encamped in a wood within a mile of the enemy's left line, and the French troops encamped on their right. Our troops remained under arms all night with their respective companies and platoons. William Feltman, Lieutenant, 1st Pennsylvania Regiment.
As we explored the land, we passed through areas where a cast of significant military figures played vital roles in the siege of Yorktown. Each sign we stopped at introduced new names, locations, and stories, bringing the landscape to life one marker at a time. And I often wonder how they figure out exactly where these locations are. I'm not sure if it's some sort of recorded coordinates that they know where the exact position of places like the field hospital we just passed by it was, but really neat to be able to visualize in your mind what took place at certain areas. Although the fields now sat silent and overgrown, emptied of armies and reclaimed by trees and wind, Each one still felt like a storybook waiting to be opened, its chapters written in footsteps, cannon fire, and the echoes of a distant past. Washington's chief of artillery was hard at work here, overseeing the setup of massive artillery pieces. The ground I walked upon once trembled under the weight of those heavy cannons, and the now empty woods right beside me were once filled with the sounds of men preparing for what was to come. A legacy of Major General Henry Knox's work was still stamped into this place, as his careful planning would have turned this area into a powerhouse for American firepower.
Americans on the right, French on the left. Extending on both sides of the river, preparations for a siege. 1/3 of the army on fatigue every day engaged in various duties, in great exertions and labor, and getting on the heavy artillery. Ebenezer Denny, Captain, Continental Army.
Further down the path, I visualized in my mind what one of Baron von Steuben's training drills might have looked like.
This is Baron von Steuben. The general was experienced in siege warfare such as characterized the Yorktown battle, and so he was invaluable to Washington. Von Steuben maintained headquarters here with his division of American troops.
Though the field was calm now, these were the exact lands Continental soldiers trained, refining their movements under the watchful eye of the Prussian officer. Von Steuben had turned an untrained, unpolished army into a mighty force, right here on the very land I was now walking.
And all along this part of the historic tour, you just have to use your imagination when you look into these woods and just imagine it full of people like Steuben's troops, encamped and inhabiting this wooded area during the siege of Yorktown. It's definitely super fascinating when you think about it.
The presence of so many general officers and the arrival of new corps seemed to give additional life to everything. Discipline, the order of the day. In all directions, troops seen exercising and maneuvering. Baron Steuben, our great military oracle. Ebenezer Denny, Captain, Continental Army.
Passing by a sign that mentioned the Marquis de Lafayette, I was reminded that back in 1781, he had already been in Virginia for months, sent by Washington to help defend the state from British forces. Part of his mission was to hunt down Benedict Arnold, the former American officer who betrayed his side at West Point and began fighting for the British, leading raids across Virginia to cut off supplies and stop reinforcements from reaching General Greene down in South Carolina. When Cornwallis shifted his forces toward Yorktown, Lafayette was quick to pick up the move and sent word to Washington. That message further fueled the general's desire to shift south, positioning himself for a confrontation that would alter the course of the campaign. Then there was Timothy Pickering. His work was hidden in the quiet of the surroundings, though its importance was impossible to ignore. Supplies had to flow, and with Pickering overseeing logistics, this was the land that saw wagons full of provisions rolling through. From food to weapons to ammunition, his coordination was the backbone of the Army's survival and success.
Supplying the American Army was always critical. At Yorktown, Colonel Timothy Pickering of Massachusetts, seconded by a man of his own choice, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Dearborn of New Hampshire, held the responsibility for Washington's quartermaster department. And you're seeing the actual grounds and wooded area of that actual site here on the battlefield.
Just a year or so before the showdown in Yorktown, Benjamin Lincoln had been humiliated by the British at Charleston, where he had to surrender in May of 1780. But now, a little over a year later, he was leading a division of the Continental Army and serving as second in command of American forces. After being imprisoned and later exchanged for British and German generals captured at Saratoga, he returned to duty with something to prove. The lands we were exploring now carry the memory of that comeback and the important role he was about to play. As we made our way further through the backwoods, we eventually reached the marshy waters of Beaver Dam Creek. I stepped out for a closer look at the swampy terrain stretching out on either side of me.
As mentioned in earlier parts of the video, this video you're watching has taken place over the course of years. Here I am during another visit, and as the sign says, the marshy, sluggish waters of the Warwick River here at the Beaver Dam Creek separated the American and French forces.
Back in the van, we kept driving, eventually veering left from the path where the French encampments began, which led to the camp of Rochambeau. Its placement wasn't random. With close proximity to Washington's camp, made it easier for two commanders to coordinate strategy and meet when it mattered most.
And I think it's clever, the location of General Washington's encampment, placed behind all the American forces, all the French forces, and separated by that marshy swamp area. Tucked away all the way back here is where you'll find Washington's encampment, strategically positioned behind his forces. And here is a sign that says, "Travel in the old way." In days past when streams were shallow, travelers forded them. Here you can do the same Washington and his men did when they went to and from his headquarters. So as Washington's men forded many shallow creeks, we'll take the Quest van across this little shallow body of water and make way towards Washington's encampment.
And finally, after fording the same small creek that troops once marched through, we then arrived at Washington's camp. It was tucked away, set back behind everything. It reminded me of the strategy of hiding a flag on a stratego board buried deep behind your lines. Protected and out of sight, but never truly out of reach.
It says General George Washington established his headquarters in this area at the junction of American encampments to the east and the French encampments to the north. Here he set up 2 tents, a large one for meeting with staff and for dining, and a smaller one as his private office and sleeping quarters. The house nearby may have served as additional shelter, while the spring over the brow of the hill to the right offered fresh water. Right here at this very spot, you'd have seen Washington himself commanding the Continental Army, coordinating with the French and overseeing the final push in what would become the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. And all that planning happened right here on these very grounds. Just imagine the strategy sessions that happened here. Maps laid out, candles burning late into the night, and Washington and his aides planning the assault on Redoubts number 9 and 10. All of that happened right here. And walking these grounds and looking at the ground, for a history fanatic, this definitely is sacred ground.
After soaking in the strategic positioning of Washington's camp and reflecting on the careful coordination between the American and French forces, we set our sights on a critical part of the battlefield, the Grand French Battery. Moving from the encampment sites, we were now headed toward the heart of the action, where artillery was about to take center stage. But before the forces could strike, the ground itself had to be prepared, shaped, and made ready for what was to come.
Last night, we began to run our first parallel on our right. The French army on the left, I believe, commenced their operations in like manner. St. George Tucker, Lieutenant Colonel and interpreter for Governor and General Thomas Nelson Jr. and his French allies.
And here it says this is a reconstructed line of earthworks replicating a French artillery battery of the Allies' first siege line. A gentle rain was falling on the night of October 6, 1781, as 1,500 soldiers quietly began constructing these fortifications, following a row of pine strips laid out by the engineering officers. Another 2,800 soldiers with muskets silently stood guard in case of a British assault.
The earthworks here weren't just about positioning artillery. They were the result of relentless digging, a step-by-step advance that brought the firepower closer and closer to the British defenses. 1,500 men digging a massive line, while over 2,000 men bravely moved forward to provide them guard while they labored through the night. Both French and American batteries along the first parallel siege line formed the backbone of the Allied strategy to break through Cornwallis's hold on Yorktown.
And right over there, you can see the British inner defense line. And this would have been the vantage point from the first siege line, as they were digging in hopes of getting closer to the British stronghold so they could do heavy bombardment. And here I am walking inside one of the trench systems. The Americans would have been actually in the direction I'm going, closer towards the York River. And somewhere along this line right here, you would have eventually gotten to the point where Washington was said to have lit the first cannon. We're headed where the American artillery power would have been, with the French artillery back there. And more than likely, it would have been something similar to this view right here. The Americans peering over their trenches, looking onward as they inched closer to the British inner defenses, knowing that they were closing in on them.
I discovered a remarkable story from the writings of Joseph Plum Martin, while he and others were assisting engineers on the line.
We had not proceeded far in the business before the engineers ordered us to desist and remain where we were, and be sure not to straggle a foot from the spot while they were absent from us. In a few minutes after their departure, there came a man alone to us, having on an overcoat, as we conjectured, it being exceedingly dark, and inquired for the engineers. We now began to be a little jealous for our safety, being alone and without arms, and within 40 rods of the British trenches. The stranger inquired what troops we were, talked familiarly with us a few minutes, when being informed which way the officers had gone. In a short time the engineers returned, and the aforementioned stranger with them. They discoursed together some time, when, by the officers often calling him Your Excellency, we discovered that it was General Washington. Joseph Plum Martin, Sergeant, Continental Army.
George Washington is said to have taken part in the digging himself, leading by example. This act was significant because it showed his commitment to the cause and his willingness to get his hands dirty with his soldiers. It was a powerful message to the French allies too, showing that Washington wasn't above the grueling work needed to bring victory. But far from the fanfare we associate him with, the gesture drew at least a hint of skepticism. The journaling Continental soldier who just had a surprise run-in with the commander-in-chief, whose writings would later offer a clear picture of the war, recalled how he may have saw the moment as more ceremonial than tactical.
The troops of the line were there, ready with entrenching tools, and began to entrench, after General Washington had struck a few blows with a pickaxe. A mere ceremony, that it might be said, General Washington, with his own hands, first broke ground at the siege of Yorktown. Joseph Plum Martin, Sergeant, Continental Army.
As we walk through a portion of the reconstructed Grand French Battery, the largest artillery built by either side during the entire siege, it was hard not to appreciate the gravity of its strategic role here. It was actually a network of 5 batteries connected by communication trenches with over 30 cannons placed within it, all part of the first Allied parallel siege line carried out under the engineering expertise of the French. This line was the initial push that set the stage for everything that followed. Being up close to these weapons, imagining them in action, was a thrilling thought. To think of the men who fired them, the strategy behind each shot, and how it began here at this very spot. With each visit to the battlefield over the years, it all slowly comes to life for me in a way that's hard to put into words. There were field guns designed for range and mobility, capable of striking at a distance with precision. A common cannon style used during the Revolutionary War. This one in front of me bore the symbols of its maker, wearing the seal of France, the fleur-de-lis, and the region of France it was forged. Then there were mortars, smaller in size but packing a punch, lobbed high into the air to rain down on the enemy. Their huge gaping mouths seemed almost disproportionate to their size, designed to launch explosive shells with deadly accuracy from above.
These sea creature looking shapes are actually ornamental lifting handles cast into the cannons in the 18th century. There's the year 1756.
And finally, the howitzers, the big bruisers of the lineup. They fired shells at a lower speed and at a slightly higher angle than the field guns. Their bombs could be dropped from above, perfect for hitting targets behind cover, but they were also sometimes fired low and would bounce or roll into enemy positions.
Pretty amazing when you realize you're getting a close inspection of the original artillery used during the Battle of Yorktown. You can see those spikes on the tread of the wheel here. I guess this gave them traction through rugged landscape.
If the timing worked, they'd explode after landing. A brutal surprise that regular cannons couldn't deliver. The original howitzer I was looking at was made in June of 1777, and it was actually used during the battle. Each weapon on the Yorktown battlefield had its role, each one a piece of the plan, but together they formed the devastating force that would slowly push the British into a corner.
Just as the sun was setting, our battery on the right and one from the French on the left opened a most tremendous blaze on the British, which continued incessantly all night. Benjamin Bartholomew, Captain, Continental Army.
On October 9th, 1781, it's believed that Washington may have been the one to light the first American cannon, another symbolic gesture marking the beginning of the siege and the assault on the British defenses.
His Excellency, General Washington, put the match to the first gun. Dr. James Thatcher, Surgeon, Continental Army.
The first parallel, some redoubts, and all our batteries were finished by the 9th at 2:00 p.m., when we opened our batteries and kept them playing continually. Henry Knox, Major General, Chief of Artillery, Continental Army.
Inside the Yorktown Battlefield Visitor Center Museum, there was a detailed presentation that captured just how much pressure Cornwallis was under. With the Chesapeake being sealed off by the French fleet in early September of 1781, what he did shortly after said a lot about just how desperate things had become.
And here's some information on Cornwallis' sunken fleet. After the French naval forces blocked the mouth of the Chesapeake, it's roughly 60 ships it mentions was trapped at Yorktown, ranging in size from 44-gun frigate to small transports. And on September 16th, Cornwallis began sinking some of these vessels, creating a barrier to prevent the Allies from approaching or launching an assault onto the beach of Yorktown.
The museum exhibit has several artifacts that were pulled from the wreckage, which was really moving to see.
And here's some of the artifacts found, which are really neat. You got a pewter teapot, half of an artillery bomb. Looks like a bottle, which it says nearly 200 bottles were recovered from the river in the 1930s. A carpenter's plane.
About 4 days after the first siege lines broke ground, French forces sank the British 44-gun frigate, whose pronunciation is up for debate, the HMS Charon.
During the night, we continued to fire bombs from the American batteries, and from our battery number 1, we fired red-hot balls at the vessels from the battery of the Upper River Offensive, and set fire to a vessel of 44 guns, the Charon, and to 2 transports. Baron Gaspard de Gallatin, Officer, Royal Dupont Regiment.
Then here is a cannon recovered from the York River in the 1930s.
There's also a 1/4 scale model of the Charon that we got to explore.
And over here is part of that Charon replica, and let's go in and have a look.
Within the subtle glow of the recrafted vessel I was exploring, it was incredible to see the cannons once mounted on the original Charon that were recovered from the river where she burned and sank.
Not finding our first siege line close enough to the enemy, our general, Monsieur de Rochambeau, decided that we had to take a position closer to the enemy. Wilhelm Graf von Schwerin, German grenadier officer, French forces.
In comparison to the fall season, it's definitely much greener out here, with a little overgrowth with the grass in the field, but amazing to be walking on the very grounds where so many soldiers were gathered, an allied unit of French and American troops coming together to overthrow the British and try to earn America its independence. And just an awesome feeling walking on this field, an almost patriotic vibe as you're here and just exploring bare fields, but almost the hum and echo of the past can be felt and heard. Something everyone should experience at least once in their lifetime, if not multiple times.
Leaving the lands of the first parallel siege line behind, we made our way toward the second. This position was crucial. It advanced the Allies closer to Yorktown and brought them within striking range of key British defenses. As I stood there, navigating the wet ground, once again, I couldn't help but imagine what it must have been like when they built this. There had been reports of rain during the first siege line's construction, making the digging even more frustrating. Here I was, struggling with passing over a puddle, thinking I was experiencing a similar discomfort. Humbling, to say the least, though I was thankful I wasn't dodging enemy fire like they were with a shovel in hand. Walking through the reconstructed earthworks, I thought about the men who had worked their way to this point, 1 inch at a time, and right under the enemy's nose.
Every second man of the whole detachment carried a fascine and shovel or a spade, and every man a shovel, spade or grubbing hoe. We dug the ditch 3.5 feet deep and 7 feet in width. William Feltman, Lieutenant, 1st Pennsylvania Regiment.
The second siege line wasn't just the continuation of the first. To reach it, soldiers dug zigzagging trenches called saps to provide cover as they advanced. This design helped protect them from straight-on cannon fire as they worked their way forward, ultimately reaching the spot where the second parallel could be dug. Even with the saps offering protection, the British were close, and every step forward was dangerous. But the men kept digging, night after night. Original tools that were probably used to dig the siege lines are on display inside the Yorktown Battlefield Visitor Center Museum. A true glimpse into the grueling effort that shaped this chapter of the war. And these could very well be the exact tools that were used to dig the siege lines. So there's no telling the history attached to these centuries-old relics. The earthworks I was walking felt calm, but I could almost hear the noise of the past. Shouts, digging, the constant barrage of enemy fire.
As desolate and empty as it is now, the imagination runs wild, and you can just imagine how populated it was behind these lines. The voices and the footsteps of the infantry, the troops. Again, this is an entirely different season you're seeing here. I'm here during the summertime. A lot of the footage you've seen throughout this video is from various seasons, but a whole different scenario here in summer. Everything's nice and green and lush. A lot of growth on the ground. Rain's coming down right now. You can hear the thunder. And the French flags are blowing in the wind as we have a weather system moving through. At the second parallel siege line, the American French forces were now within 300 yards of Cornwallis's inner British defense system. And you can see that right there. That is where the visitor center is, And all around the visitor center and throughout the inner city of Yorktown was where Cornwallis set up his final line, his inner British defense line, and would have taken his last stand. In pursuit of understanding more about the siege of Yorktown, of course, it's obviously been an ongoing educational experience for me through the years. Here I am once again at the battlefield, standing within the inner British defense system, and quite a bit of overgrowth this time around, and I actually think I see the British flag on the flagpole. The last time here, I don't believe there was a flag up there, but I'm going to wrap around this earthwork in front of me and see if I can spot it blowing in the wind. Here is a little opening that leads to what I believe is the middle of the hornwork, which would have had various areas set up around it as defense. This is the middle of that hornwork. This would have been the guardian of the city, blocking the main road into Yorktown. You had to actually go through this to get there. And if the British had anything to do with it, that wasn't going to be an easy task. And we're approaching a point at the earthworks where if you look way out in the distance, you can actually see the second parallel siege line. So at this point, you would have known, if you were the British, that your inner defense system was about to be penetrated. You can really see the vastness of these earthworks, as they would have completely surrounded the city of Yorktown, blockading any of the penetrating Allied forces from coming in, or at least they hope so.
Still standing along Yorktown's Main Street is the home of Declaration signer Thomas Nelson Jr. During the siege, he vacated the house and is said to have urged American forces to fire on it, believing the British were inside.
5 guineas to any man who puts a ball through my house. Cellar to chimney. Your coin's welcome in my pockets, Nelson.
Here we are, right outside the Nelson house. And during the siege, this house was known to have taken direct fire by many cannonballs. And actually, the holes of a couple of those cannonballs can still be seen today, later outfitted with an actual cannonball that's not original, but does fill the hole of where an actual cannonball hit on the night of the siege. And there's one of them. And it looks like you can see the impact mark of another one that doesn't have a cannonball in it, but you can definitely see the impact area right there. Just down the road from this house, his uncle's home ended up in British hands. And here I am right inside the inner British defenses, passing by the old Yorktown sign to meet the signpost for Secretary Nelson's house, which is where Cornwallis set up his headquarters. Now, the home was destroyed during the siege of Yorktown, but what's really neat is the foundations are still here, and you can actually walk right on them here in the modern day. But this is the actual foundations from that exact house where Cornwallis was stationed. The original foundations of Nelson's house, and right within this perimeter is where Cornwallis spent the final days of Yorktown, right within this house. And these are the foundations that held up the walls that surrounded him while he was inside, wondering how it was all going to end, and probably at some point realizing his time had come. And then they have a stone here commemorating the foundations of the home of Thomas Nelson, President of the Council and Secretary of State of the Colony of Virginia, erected in 1725, the first headquarters of Lord Cornwallis. It was destroyed during the Siege of Yorktown in 1781. When you begin to imagine this scene back in 1781, peeking overhead this mound of earth and looking out there in the distance and seeing the hornwork, the outskirts of Cornwallis's defenses, knowing that you were closer than ever and could fully bombard them if you could get just a little bit closer.
This line, however, still faced its biggest challenge: Redoubts 9 and 10. British fortifications that had to be captured before the second siege line could be completed.
Once reinforced, we will convert the battery and continue entrenching, using them as cover for our advance. We will then dig 2 parallels until we reach our main targets, Redoubts 9 and 10. First, we must get through the Fusiliers Redoubt on the perimeter. It is heavily fortified. If the first redoubt falls, the rest will follow.
Here we are back in the van, headed to the Redoubts, try to track down their location. And like I said, when we were here back in winter, December, we didn't get a chance to get by those, to check those out. It was, we were running out of daylight.
As we traveled further along, we spotted a sign for Redoubts 9 and 10 along the battlefield tour route.
Okay, here we go, Redoubt 9 and 10. This is where we want to go. And way out there in the distance, you can faintly see the French flags blowing near the Grand French Battery. And if you can imagine, all across these fields, these vast battlegrounds, the second parallel siege line inching closer to the British defenses. And if they could just get close enough to overtake the final 2 redoubts that stood in their way, they could complete their siege lines and more than likely defeat the British once and for all. And here's the marker for Redoubts 9 and 10, standing right under some bad weather that seems to be pushing through.
With the van now parked in a wide field before us, it wasn't immediately clear where the redoubts were situated. Walking toward the grassy area, I followed the path to the right and eventually came to Redoubt 10 first.
And here we are.
As I stepped closer, I noticed the phrase, "sharp wooden stakes sticking out of the earth." It made me think about the enemy once stationed here, British and Hessian soldiers trained to defend this position, perhaps never thinking it would soon be the target of a direct nighttime assault. But they had to have known it mattered, that they were holding one vital piece of the larger British outer defenses at Yorktown that could not be allowed to fall.
We arrived at the trenches a little before sunset. I saw several officers fixing bayonets on long staves. I then concluded we were about to make a general assault upon the enemy's works. But before dark, I was informed of the whole plan, which was to storm the redoubts, the one by the Americans and the other by the French. Joseph Plum Martin, Sergeant, Continental Army.
Now or never. Deliverance must come. We attack the Redoubt at nightfall.
When the attack came on the night of October 14th, 1781, Redoubt 10 became one of the most critical points of the siege. Under the cover of night, around 400 American troops approached silently, with unloaded muskets to maintain stealth, bayonets fixed and ready. The British and Hessian defenders thought the number around 70 to 80, began firing at the dark figures as they closed in. Washington had ordered the assault, and Lafayette, with his commander's blessing, helped oversee the plan. Alexander Hamilton, eager to prove himself, was given command of the American forces assigned to the Redoubt. A lieutenant colonel named John Lawrence would lead a supporting detachment around the rear to prevent escape during the attack. Among the invading troops was the Rhode Island Light Infantry, a predominantly African-American unit whose bravery in this assault would be vital to the campaign's success. Redoubt 10 sat right on the edge of the York River, and over the course of nearly 250 years, much of the original earthworks have been claimed by the water. The shoreline that once stretched farther out is long gone, washed away by time and tide. What stands here now is partly reconstructed, built where a section of the moat was uncovered back in 1956, and carefully restored to give visitors to the battlefield a glimpse of what once stood on this spot.
And we'll walk over here to this no trespassing sign, which we can't go in there, but we can get a quick glimpse of the York River and the tide down there. You can actually hear it.
I could hear the York River breaking against the shore as I stood near the part of the fence closest to the water.
Right here is where that brutal battle took place. All the commotion and warfare taking place under the cover of night.
The Americans stormed forward, cutting through the frays and scaling the protective walls. What followed was brutal hand-to-hand combat, fast, chaotic, and fierce. But in just a short period of time, Redoubt 10 was taken.
And what bravery and courage that would have taken to know that you're marching in to partake in a battle of that type of brutal nature.
Earlier on this day, we stopped inside the Yorktown Battlefield Visitor Center Museum, which showcases an incredible diorama, a miniature model showing the assault that took place here. Tiny figurines of soldiers across the scale version of the Redoubt under moonlight, giving you a powerful visual sense of just how intense and close quarters the fighting really was.
And here's the quite significant scene where American troops stormed Redoubt 10 in their efforts to finalize the second siege line they were digging. And I do like how this portrayal is being carried out under the blue of night as it happened.
The museum also holds some amazing artifacts that were pulled during archaeological excavations from the Redoubt No. 10 location.
Some artifacts here, the mortar fragments, grape shot, musket balls. This is a button recovered from an unrecorded location on the battlefield. Bears the letters RIR indicating the Rhode Island Regiment.
As I continued exploring the actual site where the fighting took place, I came to the memorial sign that honored the bravery of the 3 battalions that stormed Redoubt 10. Across the field, French troops had almost simultaneously fought to overtake Redoubt 9. If both redoubts were to fall into Allied hands, the British lines would become barely defensible. Strategically placed just to the north of Redoubt 10, Redoubt 9 formed part of the critical outer defenses that needed to be breached to finally break the British hold on the area.
And it looks like we have a pathway that's going to take us right through the center of the parallel second siege line. This section of the line we're walking through was actually only able to be completed after the eventual fall of Redoubt 9, and would finally give the Allied forces a clear path for close-range bombardment. And around this patch of earthworks lies Redoubt 9. But you get a really good vantage point from this hill that you get to climb up on. As you can see the elevation, but you almost can see inside it. It looks like on that side, I do see some people over there, so it looks like we might actually get to go inside of this one.
As I walked around the redoubt, I saw the phrase jutting from the earth like a line of sharpened spears, awaiting those who dared defy the crown.
And these recreations actually are made of stone, whereas the real ones were made from timber, and they were used to fortify redoubts like this one, and were typically angled horizontally in the direction of an attack, and would help to prevent earthworks from surprise assaults. Here we are inside of Redoubt 9, and this is where British soldiers attempted to hold their ground and watch the assault come straight at them, clinging to one of the last strong points guarding Yorktown's line.
This redoubt was known to be larger than the one we just explored, but like Redoubt 10, taking it would push the Allies closer to breaking the siege, and ultimately one step closer to securing victory.
And you can actually see Redoubt 10 to the north over there. Clear view from Redoubt 9. So they would have known that if one started before the other, that it was under attack. And I believe that's why it was pretty much a simultaneous attack, with the Americans going to 10 and the French invading number 9.
The assault was commanded by French Major General Baron de Villomania. Despite careful planning, the mission to invade was a daunting task. Under the cover of night, 2 French regiments, led by Colonel Vicomte de Dupont, advanced cautiously through the rough terrain. As they neared the redoubt, they came under heavy fire from the defenders. When they finally reached the perimeter, the fighting turned deadly.
It was as bright as daylight, but we ignored the firing and kept on marching. Once we got closer to the redoubt, and they could reach us with their muskets, they fired so heavily at us from out of the redoubt that we fell just like snowflakes. One could think that it rained bullets. Since we were completely surrounded by the enemy, we were almost annihilated. One screamed for help here, the other there. We had to run at a double quick pace until we finally reached the redoubt and got into the ditch, where we were without protection from the fire out of the redoubt. George Daniel Flor, enlisted German, French Royal Dupont Regiment.
Hacking away at the abattis and the frays to reach the top of the redoubt would have been quite the feat, and all while enduring the massive counterattack the British unleashed on all the approaching French troops.
Roughly 120 British and German forces were well entrenched, and the redoubt itself was outfitted with common obstacles of 18th century warfare, designed to slow and irritate enemy advance.
The enemy's abattis was found to be in much better condition than we had hoped after having bombarded this redoubt for several days with much artillery. In spite of the enemy's fire, the carpenters of the trench regiments opened some passages through the abattis, by which the grenadiers and chasseurs of the Gâtinais and Dupont entered into the fosse, and with them the same carpenters who were obliged to cut away also some palisades in order to open the frays of the Redoubt. The same grenadiers and chasseurs took advantage of these openings to mount upon the parapet, where they reformed for attack, which soon obliged those of the enemy who remained there to surrender. The enemy began at once a very lively fire of cannon and howitzers upon the redoubt which we had just captured, and thus caused the death of many more of our men. Baron Gaspard de Galaton, officer, Royal Dupont Regiment.
And here we are in another season here at Redoubt number 9. Of course, we're under some downpour currently, and we have the umbrella out. But wanted to really get a scope of what it looked like right at dusk, and it just so happens to be a rainy early evening with Redoubt 9 sitting high after all these years. And this would have been a heavily fortified British stronghold with the French forces attacking this just right about 7 o'clock at night in parallel to the American forces over at Redoubt 10. And as you can see, the weather isn't playing around. We have a heavy weather system rolling through on the Yorktown battlefield.
Despite tough resistance, the French forces managed to overpower the enemy, securing Redoubt 9 and overtaking another stronghold.
The whole redoubt was so full of dead and wounded that one had to walk on top of them. George Daniel Flor enlisted German, French Royal Dupont Regiment.
Took them a little longer on this one, and this one was known to be much bloodier of a fight. Took a little longer to overtake, but in the end, the French forces were successful, and the Americans and French forces finally took over Redoubts 9 and 10.
On the night of October 15th, 1781, the British made one last desperate attempt to break through and retake a redoubt, but it didn't work. Their defenses were shattered once again. Now, the American and French forces were within 400 yards of the British, a range where they could fully bombard them without mercy from now 3 directions. Cornwallis and his men tried to escape the Gloucester Point, but the weather had other plans, with strong winds and storms making it impossible for them to escape. By the morning of October 17th, 1781, Cornwallis knew he couldn't keep going, so he sent out a drummer and an officer with a white flag to signal an intention of surrender. The military journal of Ebenezer Denny recalls this moment.
In the morning, before relief came, had the pleasure of seeing a drummer mount the enemy's parapet and beat a parley, and immediately an officer, holding up a white handkerchief, made his appearance outside their works. The drummer accompanied him, beating. Ebenezer Denny, Captain, Continental Army.
A message was then sent to George Washington by Cornwallis. He wrote,
Sir, I propose a cessation of hostilities for 24 hours, and that 2 officers may be appointed by each side to meet at Mr. Moore's house to settle terms for the surrender of the posts of York and Gloucester. Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis, British Army.
The next day, on October 18th, 1781, the 2 sides met at the Moore House in Yorktown to iron out the details.
Commissioners from both armies met at a house between the lines to agree upon articles of capitulation. We waited with anxiety the termination of the armistice, and as the time drew nearer, our anxiety increased. The time at length arrived, it passed, and all remained quiet. and now we concluded that we had obtained what we had taken so much pains for which we had encountered so many dangers and had so anxiously wished. Joseph Plum Martin, Sergeant, Continental Army.
Over the years, we'd visited Yorktown plenty of times, but somehow we never explored the grounds of the home where the terms of the surrender took place. On this visit, though, we decided to change that. We'd traveled this route before more than once, but now we were finally circling back to where it all ended to dive in deeper. As we drove the mile or so from the main lines toward the Morehouse, I envisioned the American troops who once made this same journey the other direction, guarded by the high embankment that gave them cover from cannon fire as they drew closer to enemy territory. Here is the American approach road. The steep banks of the ravine gave American troops protection from British cannon fire as they moved up to build and man the siege lines. We followed the winding road past the clear waters of Wormley Pond that at second glance appeared nearly turquoise to me. Slowing down to take in a few scenic spots along the way, I occasionally got out and stood by, just for a minute, soaking in the scene before continuing on.
2 nights ago, my Eliza, my duty and my honor, obliged me to take a step in which your happiness was too much risked. I commanded an attack upon one of the enemy's redoubts. We carried it in an instant, and with little loss. You will see the particulars in the Philadelphia papers. There will be certainly nothing more of this kind. Alexander Hamilton, Lieutenant Colonel, Continental Army, to his wife Eliza Hamilton.
Now with the Morehouse coming into clear view, I was more than ready to have a look around. Built around 1725 and later purchased by Augustine Moore in 1768, the house wasn't chosen for its charm, but for its location. It sat far enough from the battle lines to be safe, and it survived the siege without damage. Cornwallis, needing a place for the terms of surrender to be discussed, likely saw the Moore house as the only logical choice, and so this peaceful home, quiet and isolated, became the setting for one of the most defining moments in American history. Walking slowly toward the house, making my way across the yard, I was reminded that this place once stood at the edge of a world-changing struggle for freedom. Inside, decisions were made that helped turn the course of the war.
And I believe they're uncertain of the exact room inside the Moore house where the British and French and American military men met to draw up the surrender terms. But the scene most likely took place in the parlor, the formal sitting room at the front of the house, where the men probably sat down and drew up the surrender terms.
I tried to imagine what it must have felt like for the delegates as they arrived that day. Tense and exhausted, but aware of what needed to be done. Inside this residence, British officers Major Alexander Ross and Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Dundas sat across from American and French representatives, John Laurens, handpicked by General Washington, and Viscount de Noailles, Lafayette's brother-in-law, chosen by Rochambeau. They came here to put into writing what had already been decided on the battlefield.
But this is where the surrender terms were drawn up, figured out over the course, I believe, nearly 2 days. And like a lot of old colonial homes, you got the double chimney on both sides of the house. Here's a interesting outbuilding. Looks a little more modern day.
Walking around the house, I passed beneath the old windows, noting some siding was withering away, revealing the home's age.
Definitely showing some wear on the exterior. Got some wood rot. So even though it's been restored, it appears the restoration is also showing its age. And it looks like the brick in this chimney could be from the original 18th century chimney of long ago. Of course, minus the more recent mortar. A lot of times the windows are completely original in these old colonial homes, so it's rather fascinating to take a closer look at them. And you can see that it indeed is from an earlier century.
The outbuildings on the property later triggered an interesting realization. Parts of a 1984 miniseries about George Washington's life were once filmed here. The unique ice house at the side of the yard was a dead giveaway.
George! George is home!
Also, the stone-built outbuilding with a high-pitched roof that stood before me is clearly shown in this scene.
It's good to see you again, Mother. And be home with the family.
As I approached the porch on the far side of the house, I spotted the door and became curious if it was the real thing or a later addition. I thought about how, back in Williamsburg, it's not unusual for doors like this to still be original. From here, you can see the York River stretching out beyond the trees and bushes, and it felt surreal knowing that while this house overlooked such a calm view, its rooms once held hours of intense negotiation. Reading somewhere that the talks went late into the night. 14 articles were drafted outlining the terms of Cornwallis's surrender. These became the defining articles of capitulation for this historic moment. Lawrence is said to have carried the rough version back to Washington, who read it and made a few small edits before sending it on to Cornwallis. The articles outlined everything: how the British would surrender, where the troops would go, and even what kind of formal occasion would mark the moment. The third article of the surrender dealt with the ceremony, what it would look like when the British laid down their arms. In any other surrender, the defeated army would be allowed to march out proudly, flags waving, playing the victor's song. But not this time. Washington remembered what happened in Charleston the year before, when an American army had surrendered and been denied those same honors.
The garrison of York will march out to a place to be appointed in front of the posts at 2 o'clock precisely, with shouldered arms, colors cased, and drums beating a British or German march. They are then to ground their arms and return to their encampments, where they will remain until they are dispatched to the places of their destination. The garrisons of York and Gloucester, including the officers and seamen of His Britannic Majesty's ships, as well as other mariners, to surrender themselves prisoners of war to the combined forces of America and France. The land troops to remain prisoners to the United States. The Navy to the Naval Army of His Most Christian Majesty.
By the afternoon of October 19th, Washington was thought to have signed off while standing within the overtaken Redoubt 10.
Done in the trenches before York, October 19th, 1781.
It took us a while to finally take in a good explore here. But as we pulled away from the Morehouse, headed toward the field where the surrender happened, it was clear. There was something about the place we just visited that felt suspended in time.
The next day, we were ordered to put ourselves in as good order as our circumstances would admit, to see the British Army march out and stack their arms. The trenches, where they crossed the road leading to the town, were leveled, and all things put in order for this grand exhibition. Joseph Plum Martin, Sergeant, Continental Army.
After our exploration, we drove towards Surrender Field. The grounds where weapons were dropped, ranks broken, and where the British would become prisoners of war. Upon arriving, Sarah and I followed the stone walkway leading to the observation tower. Barely there, but as we walked it, the history surrounding me seemed to tug at my senses already. By the time we reached the tower at the top, the full sweep of the field slowly came into view. A wide, uninterrupted span of earth lied before us that had once seen thousands gathered upon it. At the open-air lookout, a nearby sign recounted the British surrender, sharing stories from American soldiers about acts of defiance and disrespect during the surrender process, including the words of British troops who described the moment with a mix of pride, bitterness, and shame. Just below it, a button played a recorded narration of the event.
This is the place. On this field, October 19, 1781, the soldiers of General Charles Lord Cornwallis' army surrendered their arms and regimental flags.
Around the inner parts of the lookout rotunda, quotes from both Washington and Cornwallis hung on the walls.
I have the honor to inform Congress that a reduction of the British Army under the command of Lord Cornwallis is most happily effected.
We stood quietly for a while, looking down onto the field as I was trying to piece together in my mind how it might have looked and felt.
This is to us a most glorious day, but to the English, one of bitter chagrin and disappointment. Preparations are now making to receive as captives that vindictive, haughty commander and that victorious army who, by their robberies and murders, have so long been a scourge to our brethren of the southern states. Dr. James Thatcher, Surgeon, Continental Army.
Eventually, descending the tower's spiral walkway, I came across a sign that described the sheer volume of arms surrendered on the field that lied directly beside me.
These mounted trophies engraved with the inscription, "Surrendered by the capitulation of Yorktown, October 19, 1781, represent a fraction of the spoils of war captured by the Allied forces. Displayed here are the British brass guns, howitzers, and mortars. Washington's official report to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia accounted for 244 artillery pieces in all, as well as thousands of military supplies and other implements of war." So this is only a small fraction of what they actually surrendered on that day. And each one bearing British emblems that mark them as property of the monarchy, although each were seized during the surrender. Quite the thing to see, knowing that these were the very artillery pieces used to fight the Americans and the French until their day of capture and surrender. Passing the trophy case of captured British artillery mounted along the winding descent path, I finally reached ground level. The short trail that lied before me would lead to Surrender Road. The defeated British forces marched along this road from Yorktown to this very point under strict orders. Washington had demanded they arrive precisely at 2 p.m., but they didn't. Whether due to disorganization, protest, or something else, they were late. Cornwallis himself didn't attend, claiming he had fallen ill. And it does say on October 19th, 1781, the now paved road on your right was lined by American soldiers on the right and French soldiers on the left. And every eye was trained upon the arrival of the British troops. So the paved road to my right, the one we drove in on, is the actual road they would have traveled down to reach this field and surrender to the Allied forces. So I'll walk over here and get a little closer perspective of where Surrender Road is known to have lied. So according to that sign, this is the paved road to the right. So that would have been where the British surrendered, marching down this road, spectators on either side, celebrating the victory at Yorktown. Between the victorious Allies, the surrendering troops filed through. Wanting to immerse myself in the scene as much as possible, I walked a portion of the now paved road.
Our army was drawn up in a line on each side of the road, extending from our parallel to the forks of the road at Hudson Allens. The Americans on the right, the French on the left. Through these lines, the whole British army marched, their drums in front, beating a slow march. Their colors furled and cased. I am told they were restricted by the capitulation from beating a French or American march. The sight was too pleasing to an American to admit of description. St. George Tucker, Lieutenant Colonel and interpreter for Governor and General Thomas Nelson Jr. and his French allies.
With the presence of both armies silent and watching, it was easy to see how overwhelming the moment must have been. Eventually, I stepped off the road into the field itself, slipping through an opening in the split rail fencing. Walking across the actual surrender field was mesmerizing. I thought of the tense scene that took place here as second in command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, appointed by Cornwallis to lead the troops to surrender in his place, came into view. O'Hara, deliberately bypassing Washington and the Continental Army, rode straight to the French side and offered Rochambeau his sword. The French commander, uninterested in the show of defiance, pointed him on to the rightful commander of all Allied forces. When O'Hara finally reached him, Washington didn't flinch. He offered no polite gestures, no unnecessary words. He had made it very clear from the beginning he would only accept the surrender from Cornwallis himself. With measured calm, Washington met him with a stern, unreadable glance, one that probably said more than words ever could. Then he turned and directed him to General Benjamin Lincoln, his own second in command. The man who had once been forced to surrender to the British just over a year before. It wasn't dramatic, it was calculated. Washington wasn't just accepting a surrender, he was making a point. After laying down their arms before the American and French lines, the British and German troops were marched off to prison camps in Virginia, Maryland, and other areas. It was more than the end of a siege. It marked the unraveling of Britain's grip on the colonies and the first real step toward peace, though the war would continue for 2 more years. But in 1783, the Treaty of Paris would finally bring it all to an end, confirming the independence that so many had fought to earn. With every visit to the battlefield, I realize the sheer amount of history packed into this vast stretch of land is staggering. There's so much to learn and see here. Every part of this place carries its own story, and there's never enough time to tell it all. An untouched Redoubt comes to mind. The only original one still standing, abandoned by Cornwallis the day after the Allied forces arrived in Yorktown. Semi-hidden and undisturbed, it was left as it was, and what remains has eroded over time. It felt different seeing it like this. No modern recreation, no distractions, just the remnants of what was once there, sunken and raw. Hard to describe, but amazing to experience. Just south of the French artillery park, we also visited the French cemetery. A simple stone cross and memorial plaque there honor 50 unknown French soldiers who died during the battle. A solemn place, reminding us that this was never just an American fight. These men fought for something bigger, far from home, and their story lives on in quiet corners like this one. Driving near the shores of the York River, another fascinating location we stumbled into was the cave that Cornwallis was rumored to have hidden in during the heavy bombardment. Cut into the caverns that face the river, it's still a place that holds a bit of mystery, whether he truly hid there or not. By the end of the day on our last visit here, I found myself standing next to the Yorktown Victory Monument. As I stood beneath it, I really honed in on the symbolism that covered it. Lady Liberty standing high above with her arms wide open. 38 stars circling the monument, marking the number of states in the Union when it was erected. The 13 female figures at the base, representing the original 13 colonies. After everything we'd seen and learned over the years, I began to clearly understand the monument didn't just mark a victory. It stood as a lasting tribute to those who fought to make it possible. Standing on this ground, you realize that the past is never as far away as it might seem. It's just beneath the surface. Always there, reminding us of how much was sacrificed and the lasting impact it left behind.